For almost 100 years, there was a river in Washington state that could not reach its own beginning. It started high in the mountains, ran down through deep forest, and then, partway down, it slammed into a wall of concrete and simply stopped being a river. Above that wall, the water pooled into a flat, dead reservoir. Below it, the river carried on to the sea, but it carried almost nothing alive. The salmon that had once filled it, hundreds of thousands of them, so many that people said you could almost walk across their backs, were gone. 2 dams had cut the river in half, and for a century the Elwha ran silent. And then, one morning, the machines arrived to tear the dams down. Not to repair them, to destroy them. It was the largest dam removal ever attempted anywhere on Earth, and no one truly knew what would happen when a river that had been strangled for 100 years was suddenly set free. Some feared disaster. What actually happened over the months and years that followed was so fast and so complete that even the scientists who had fought for it were stunned. The first thing to understand is that nobody was tearing down these dams because they had failed. They worked. For decades they had made electricity. The problem was everything they had quietly killed to do it. The Elwha River runs through the Olympic Peninsula, a wild corner of the Pacific Northwest, where the mountains catch the ocean rain and grow some of the thickest temperate rainforest on the continent. Before the concrete, the Elwha was one of the greatest salmon rivers on that coast. Every year, enormous runs of salmon surged up out of the Pacific and fought their way inland, climbing the river to spawn in the cold gravel where they themselves had hatched. There were said to be 10 distinct runs of fish, including gigantic chinook salmon, some of them reportedly the size of a human leg. The whole river, from the sea to the high mountain streams, was built around that annual flood of fish. Then, in the early 1900s, came the first dam. It was thrown across the lower river to generate power for the growing region, and it was built without any way for fish to get past it. No ladder, no passage, nothing. On the day that dam closed, the salmon coming in from the ocean hit the concrete and could go no further. A little later, a second, even larger dam was built further upstream, deep in what is now a national park. Between the two of them, they sealed off almost the entire river. Over 90% of the salmon habitat, all the miles of pristine mountain spawning gravel above the dams, was suddenly locked behind a wall the fish could never climb. What followed was a slow collapse that took generations to fully show itself. The salmon runs, cut off from almost all their spawning grounds, crashed. From hundreds of thousands of fish, the Elwha runs fell to a few thousand, clinging to the short stretch of river still open below the lower dam. And as the salmon vanished, the effects spread outward in ways that were invisible at first, but ran through the entire landscape. To picture what was lost, you have to picture what the river had been. In its prime, the Elwha was not a quiet stream, it was a highway of fish. For a few weeks each year, the runs turned the water dark with bodies. Salmon stacked head to tail, fighting upward against the current, in numbers almost impossible to imagine today. Those fish fed everything. They fed the people, they fed the bears that waited at the rapids, they fed the eagles overhead, and when they died, they fed the forest itself. A river like that is not a line on a map. It is a pulse, an annual heartbeat that pushed the wealth of the entire ocean up into the mountains. The dams did not just stop water, they stopped the heartbeat. Because a salmon run is not just fish. When hundreds of thousands of salmon swim in from the ocean and die in a river after spawning, they bring the ocean with them. Their bodies are packed with nutrients gathered from years at sea, and when they die and rot in the streams, they fertilize the whole system. Bears and eagles and wolves eat them and carry them into the forest. Insects feed on them. The trees themselves take up the nutrients from the salmon carcasses. Scientists can measure ocean chemistry inside the wood of streamside trees, put there by generations of dead salmon. When the salmon disappeared from the upper Elwha, that entire flow of ocean nutrients into the forest was switched off. The river was not just missing fish, it was starving. There was also a people whose entire world had been built around those fish. The Lower Elwha Klallam Tribe had lived alongside this river for countless generations, and the salmon were the center of their culture, their food, and their identity. When the dams went in, no one asked them, and the loss of the salmon was a loss of a way of life. For decades, They never stopped pushing to bring the river back. The fight to remove these dams was, more than anything, their fight, carried on year after year, long after most people had accepted the dams as permanent. And here is the part that makes the Elwha different from almost every other dam story. The people who wanted the river back did not lose. After decades of struggle, of studies, of legal battles and political fights, the decision was finally made. The dams would come down. The river would be given a chance to heal, but wanting a dam gone and actually removing it are two very different things. And this is where the real gamble began, because behind those dams sat a hidden monster that terrified even the people who wanted them gone. Stay with me here, and if a story about a landscape brought back from the dead is the kind of thing you want more of, take a moment to subscribe, because what came down out of those reservoirs is the part almost no one sees coming. The monster was mud. For 100 years, the two dams had not only blocked fish, they had blocked sediment. Every river carries sand, gravel, rock, and silt down from the mountains toward the sea. That is how rivers build their beds, their bars, and the beaches at their mouths. But the Elwha dams had trapped a century of that sediment, holding back an astonishing amount of accumulated sand and rock in the reservoirs behind them. Estimates put it at many millions of cubic yards, enough material to bury a large area many feet deep. That trapped sediment created a genuine fear. If you simply blew the dams open, all of that mud and sand could wash downstream in one catastrophic surge, choking the river, smothering the very salmon beds you were trying to save, and burying everything downstream. Removing the dams too fast could kill the river just as surely as building them had. So the engineers could not just demolish the concrete and walk away. They had to take the dams down slowly, in careful stages, lowering the reservoirs bit by bit, letting the river itself pick up and carry the sediment at a pace it could handle. It became one of the most closely watched experiments in the history of river science, and honestly, no one was completely sure it would work. The takedown began, and the machines chewed through the concrete piece by piece over many months. Excavators perched on the dam faces, breaking them down in careful layers, while engineers watched the water level fall behind them and measured how much sediment the freed river was carrying. It was not a single dramatic explosion. It was a slow, deliberate unmaking, a wall that had taken years to build being taken apart with the patience of people who knew that one wrong move could ruin everything. The lower dam came out first, then the great upper dam, notch by notch as the water dropped. And as the reservoirs drained away, they revealed something haunting. The old drowned valleys came back into daylight for the first time in a century, vast flats of gray sediment where the lakes had been, dotted with the pale stumps of the ancient forest that had been flooded when the dams first closed. For a moment it looked like a wasteland, a gray, dead moonscape of mud. Then the river went to work, and the speed of what happened next is the part that stunned everyone. Freed from the concrete, the Elwha immediately began doing what rivers do. It started carving through the exposed sediment, picking it up and carrying it downstream, cutting new channels, moving mountains of trapped sand toward the sea. And rather than the feared catastrophe, this turned out to be the river feeding itself. All that sediment, released at a pace the river could manage, flowed down to the coast and began rebuilding what had been lost there too. At the mouth of the river, where the beaches had been starved of sand for a century and had eroded away, new beaches and sandbars began to grow. The coastline itself started to rebuild, grain by grain, out of the sediment that had been locked behind the dams for 100 years. On the bare gray flats where the reservoirs had been, life returned far faster than anyone had dared predict. Seeds that blew in or washed down took hold in the fresh sediment. Within a few short seasons, the dead moonscape was green, colonized by grasses, then willows and young trees, the first stage of a forest reclaiming ground that had been underwater for a century. The tribe and volunteers planted native species by hand, seeding the return of the forest. What had looked like a wasteland became, remarkably quickly, a living valley again. But the real question, the one the whole century of struggle came down to, was the salmon. Would they come back, after 100 years locked out of their own river, with the runs reduced to a fragile remnant? Would the fish actually find their way up past the vanished dams and back into the mountain gravel their ancestors had used? They did, and they did it almost immediately. For the tribe, this was the moment a century of grief had been building toward. Elders who had grown up hearing stories of the great salmon runs, but had never seen them, stood on the banks and watched fish climb back into water their grandparents had been robbed of. Children saw salmon in the upper river for the first time in the history of their families. It was not just an ecological recovery, it was the return of something that had been taken from a people, handed back by the river itself. Salmon carry an ancient drive to push upstream, to reach the highest, cleanest water they can find to spawn. For a century, that drive had ended at a wall. The moment the wall was gone, the fish simply kept going. Within months of the upper river opening, salmon were found spawning in stretches of the Elwha that had been blocked to them for 100 years. They pushed up past where the dams had stood, into the cold upper river, inside the national park, reclaiming spawning grounds no salmon had touched in a century. Steelhead, chinook, and other fish began to reappear above the old dam sites. The river remembered what it was for, and so did the fish. And as the salmon returned, the whole starved system began to switch back on. The fish carrying ocean nutrients up into the mountains meant the forest and the river started, once again, to be fed by the sea. Birds and animals that follow the salmon runs came back to the banks. The estuary at the mouth of the river, rebuilt with new sediment, became richer habitat. Piece by piece, a living machine that had been switched off for 100 years began to hum again, powered by fish that had waited a century for the wall to fall. Now it is important to be honest about what this does and does not mean, because the Elwha is a triumph, but it is not a magic trick. The recovery has been real and fast, but it has not been instant or perfect in every way. Some fish runs have rebounded strongly, while others have been slower and more fragile, still working their way back toward their old numbers. The huge pulse of released sediment, while it rebuilt beaches, also caused real short-term disruption downstream while the river worked through it. And the Elwha had one enormous advantage that most rivers do not. Above the dams, the vast majority of its watershed sits inside a protected national park, pristine, undamaged, and ready. The moment the dams came down, the salmon had clean, perfect habitat waiting for them. A river choked with pollution or surrounded by cities would not bounce back the same way just because you removed a dam. So the Elwha is not a promise that you can tear down any dam and instantly heal any river. It is proof of something more specific and, in a way, more powerful. It is proof that when the underlying habitat is still intact, a river and its salmon can recover from a century of damage with breathtaking speed if you simply get out of the way and let the water run. The land had not forgotten how to be a river. It had just been waiting for the chance. That is the thing that lingers about the Elwha. For 100 years, two walls of concrete held back not just water and fish, but an entire living system, frozen and starved. Everyone assumed that a century of damage would take another century to undo. Instead, the river tore through the old sediment, rebuilt its own beaches, greened its own dead valleys, and welcomed its salmon home in a matter of years, not lifetimes. The recovery was not something people did to the river. It was something the river did the instant it was allowed to. Today, the Elwha runs unbroken from the mountains to the sea for the first time in 100 years. Salmon climb it again into the heart of the wilderness. New forest grows where reservoirs used to sit. New beaches build at its mouth. And the people who never stopped fighting for it can once again stand on its banks and watch the fish come home. America tore down its biggest dams, and the dead river did not stay dead. It came roaring back to life faster than anyone believed possible, and it reminded us of something we forget too easily, that nature is not always fragile and slow to heal. Sometimes it is just waiting, held back behind a wall, for someone to finally let it go. If you enjoy true stories of the wild pulled back from the very edge, stories most people never hear, then like this video and subscribe. In the next one, we will follow another place the world had already given up on. Take care of yourself and stay curious.